I bet you've never seen a general count down the days until his wife's death just to ruin his own daughter's career. 3 days after my mother's funeral, my father stood in the middle of her study, holding her last will and testament like it was a winning lottery ticket. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the entire billion-dollar defense empire my mother had helped him build. He looked at me, not with the eyes of a father, but of an opponent who had just won the war, and uttered the words he had clearly been waiting a long time to say, "Pack your things. Your mother isn't here to protect you anymore." What he didn't know was that my mother had been watching him too. While he was counting down the days to her death, she was building an extraordinary legacy, a legal chess game designed to destroy him at the very moment he thought he had everything. Hello everyone, I'm Major Amani Burns, 32 years old. And today I'm going to share how my 8 years as a ghost strategist ended with my father losing his entire empire in front of 300 generals and Pentagon officials. All because he couldn't hide his true nature for just 30 more days. If you believe in justice, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The silence in my mother's study was a physical weight. It was a silence that grief hadn't yet filled, only hollowed out. It had been 3 days since we buried her, 72 hours since I had last felt the ground beneath my feet feel solid. The room still smelled of her, a faint comforting scent of lavender and old books that clung to the velvet curtains. I was sitting in her worn leather armchair, tracing the patterns on the Persian rug with my eyes, doing anything to keep from looking at the empty space behind her mahogany desk. The door opened without a knock. My father, General Marcus Burns, retired, strode in. He wasn't wearing his morning suit. He was in a crisp, tailored business suit, looking more like he was about to close a deal than grieve a wife of 35 years. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't acknowledge the suffocating sadness in the room. He walked directly to her desk and placed a thick manila envelope on the polished surface with a dry, definitive thud. $33 million, all company shares, this house. He spoke to the room, not to me. His voice was brisk, devoid of emotion, the voice of a CEO announcing quarterly earnings. Your mother finally did something right. He pulled the documents from the envelope, his fingers eagerly flipping through the pages. I watched as a sick, feverish light ignited in his eyes. He wasn't reading the final words of the woman he was supposed to love. He was auditing a transfer of assets. This wasn't a legacy. It was an acquisition. A chill, slick and oily, slid down my spine. It was a cold so profound that it burned, a feeling of revulsion so strong it momentarily eclipsed my grief. This man hadn't lost a wife. He had liquidated a partnership. When he finished reading, he finally turned his attention to me. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, a conqueror's smile. It was the same look he had when Aegis Defense landed a new government contract. This will doesn't mention your name. Do you understand what that means? He asked, his voice low and smooth. He took a step closer, invading the sanctuary of my mother's space. I could smell his expensive cologne, a sharp scent trying to suffocate the lavender. It means the charade is over. Pack your things. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, laced with years of resentment. Your mother isn't here to protect you anymore. The word your instead of our was a final, precise cut, severing the last thread that connected us. In that moment, the terrible truth I had suppressed for years became crystal clear. In his eyes, I was never his daughter. I was just an accessory that came with the brilliant wife he had to tolerate, an inconvenient part of the package deal. Now, the main asset had been secured, and the accessory was being discarded. But his cruelty wasn't finished. Words weren't enough. He needed to desecrate the memory itself. He began to walk around the room, picking up her things. My mother's things. He saw a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon on her bookshelf. My letters. The ones I had sent her every week from West Point, filled with my fears, my struggles, and my small victories. He picked them up, scanned the first page with a dismissive sneer, and tossed the entire bundle into the wastebasket. Sentimental garbage, he muttered. My breath caught in my throat, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a combination of shock and a lifetime of conditioned obedience. His eyes then landed on the porcelain angel on the corner of her desk. I had given it to her last Christmas. It was a small, simple thing, but she loved it. She said it reminded her of me. He picked it up, turned it over in his large hands as if assessing its monetary value, and then set it down on the desk with a sharp, deliberate crack. A wing broke off, and the angel listed to one side, broken. "Clean up this junk, too," he commanded, his gaze sweeping over the room as if it were a barracks in need of inspection. Every action was a calculated strike, an attempt to erase her, to erase us, right in front of me. He wasn't just kicking me out, he was trying to annihilate my soul. He glanced at the gold Rolex on his wrist. "You have 72 hours, he declared, his voice once again the cold, authoritative tone of a commanding officer. "After that, I'm having the security team from Aegis change the locks and clear this place out. If you're still here, I'll have the MPs escort you off the property. Don't embarrass me any further, Major." He spat my rank like an insult, a final reminder that everything I had worked for, every ounce of sweat and blood I'd poured into my career, was ultimately under his control. I just stood there, a ghost in my own home, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my mother's life and the smoking ruins of my own. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, the sound echoing in the deadly silence. He left me alone with the broken angel, the discarded letters, and the lingering scent of lavender. As my world tilted on its axis, my eyes fell on the one thing he hadn't touched. It was a small, tarnished silver frame on my mother's desk. Inside was a photo of her, years younger, her smile genuine and full of light. With numb fingers, I reached out and clutched it. It was the only thing I took with me when I left. The only thing I had left. The silver picture frame felt cold in my hand, its sharp edges digging into my palm. My mother's smile, frozen in time, was a beacon from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. That smile. For 8 years, it had been my secret armor. People see the uniform, the rank, the last name Burns, and they assume a legacy of honor. They don't see the silent, systematic theft that happened behind closed doors, in the sterile conference rooms of the Pentagon, and under the glittering chandeliers of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive clubs. My mind drifted back 6 months, to a high-pressure briefing in a secure room deep within the Pentagon. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and tension. I was at the podium, presenting the final operational analysis for Project Chimera, a revolutionary drone swarm defense system. It was my baby. I had spent 18 months developing the core strategy, running thousands of simulations, pulling all-nighters fueled by nothing but lukewarm coffee and sheer determination. For 20 minutes, I laid out the plan. Every vector of attack, every countermeasure, every logistical detail. When I finished, the room was quiet. General Peterson, a 4-star with eyes that had seen 3 different wars, nodded slowly. He looked at me, not at my father sitting at the head of the table. "Major Burns," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Your analysis is razor-sharp. This is one of the most innovative battle plans I've seen in a decade." A warmth bloomed in my chest, a rare feeling of professional pride. I had done it. My work, my mind, was being seen. But the moment was fleeting. Before I could even say thank you, my father stood up. He walked over to me, placed a heavy proprietary hand on my shoulder, and chuckled. It was a loud, booming laugh that commanded the room's attention. "Thank you, General," he said, beaming at Peterson. "The kid did a great job taking notes on my ideas." Just like that, with a single sentence, he erased me. He demoted me from architect to stenographer. The warmth in my chest turned to ice. I felt the eyes of every other officer in the room on me. I had to stand there, force a tight, professional smile, and nod as if I were grateful for the backhanded compliment. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." Inside, my self-respect was fracturing into a million pieces. I could see the pity and discomfort in the eyes of a few colonels, but no one dared to speak up. No one ever did. My father's gravitational pull was too strong. That was his public method. In more celebratory settings, his tactics were even more humiliating. I remember the gala dinner at the Army and Navy Club in D.C. It was to celebrate Aegis landing the multi-billion-dollar Desert Fang contract, a contract secured entirely by a risk assessment matrix I had designed. The room was a sea of dress uniforms and evening gowns, the air buzzing with power and self-congratulation. My father took the stage, a glass of bourbon glowing like amber in his hand. He gave a rousing speech, thanking his tireless team and the unwavering support of the Department of Defense. Then he paused, and his eyes scanned the room until they found me. I was seated at a small, out-of-the-way table in the back, where I was told to sit. And of course, he said, raising his glass in my direction, I have to thank Amani for making sure the coffee was always hot and the documents were always collated. The little things make the big things happen. A wave of polite laughter rippled through the audience. They thought it was a charming, fatherly joke, a little jab. But it wasn't a joke. It was a public execution of my credibility. He wasn't just stealing my work, he was turning my contribution into a punchline, reducing me to the role of an administrative assistant in front of the entire defense establishment. I had to smile, raise my water glass in acknowledgement, and swallow the bitter taste of humiliation along with the applause meant for him. His cruelty at work was never loud. He never yelled, never berated me in front of others. It was far more insidious, a slow-acting poison. He would assign me impossible tasks, missions with unattainable deadlines and conflicting parameters. If you're really as smart as your mother says you are, you'll figure it out, he'd say with a challenging smirk. When, through sheer force of will, I succeeded, he would present the results as his own brilliant foresight. If I struggled, if I pointed out a flaw in his initial premise, he would sigh dramatically in meetings with other executives. I had such high hopes, he'd lament, shaking his head. Perhaps she just doesn't have the instinct for it. He systematically built a narrative around me, the favored daughter given a position she didn't earn, incompetent and coasting on her father's name. He created the very cage he accused me of living in. One night, after a particularly brutal day where he'd taken credit for a breakthrough that had cost me weeks of sleep, I came home completely broken. I collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, too exhausted to even cry. A few minutes later, my mother, Evelyn, came in. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me to be strong. She just set a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup on the coffee table in front of me. The same comfort food she'd made for me since I was a little girl with a scraped knee. She sat down beside me, waiting until I had taken a few spoonfuls. Then she looked me straight in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. Marcus isn't fighting you because he hates you, Amani, she said, her voice soft but firm. He's fighting you because he fears you. You are a mirror reflecting his own inadequacy. Never, ever forget that. She took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Your strength isn't measured by how much you can endure, she continued. It's measured by knowing when you've endured enough. Her words planted a seed in my exhausted mind. For the first time, I began to see my silence not as strength, but as permission. My endurance wasn't honorable, it was enabling. Clutching the picture frame in the dark, I could almost hear her voice again, a whisper from the past cutting through the fog of my present despair. Honor isn't on the shoulder board, sweetheart, it's in what you do when no one is watching. Honor, my mother had said, is what you do when no one is watching. For the next 72 hours, no one was watching. No one cared to. My world had shrunk to the 4 dented doors of my old Jeep Wrangler. It held everything I owned. 3 sets of BDUs, my dress uniform hanging limply from a hook, a box of personal files, and a few $1,000s in savings that suddenly felt like pocket change. The first night was the worst. After leaving my childhood home, I just drove, aimlessly. I circled the familiar streets of Arlington, Virginia, past the tidy colonial houses with their manicured lawns and glowing windows. Each window held a life I no longer had access to. A world of warmth, safety, and belonging. The city I had sworn to protect now felt alien and hostile. Eventually, the gas needle dipped toward empty, and I pulled into the sprawling, unnervingly bright parking lot of a 24/7 Walmart. I found a spot in a far corner, under a flickering fluorescent lamp, killed the engine, and reclined my seat. This was my home now, Sleep was impossible. The relentless October chills seeped through my thin army jacket, making my teeth chatter. Every clang of a shopping cart, every rumble of a passing truck, every distant shout sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept thinking about the irony of it. I was Major Amani Burns. I had planned complex logistical operations in hostile territories. I had been responsible for the lives of hundreds of soldiers. And here I was, unable to secure a safe place to lay my head for the night. The feeling of homelessness, of being utterly stripped of my identity, was a humiliation that cut deeper than any of my father's words. It wasn't just that I had lost my home, I had lost my place in the world. The next morning, desperation clawed at me. I scrolled through my phone, my fingers hesitating over the names of colleagues I considered friends. I took a deep breath and called Mark, a fellow major I'd worked with on the Chimera project. "Hey, Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Listen, I know this is out of the blue, but I'm in a bit of a bind. Could I possibly crash on your couch for a couple of days?" Silence. Then a nervous cough. "Oh, hey, Amani. Wow. Let me check the schedule. The wife. Things are kind of hectic here right now." I knew. I called 2 more people. The answers were different, but the message was the same. Awkward pauses, vague excuses. I could hear the fear in their voices. The news had clearly already traveled through the Pentagon grapevine, likely courtesy of my father himself. I was no longer Major Burns, the rising star. I was the disgraced daughter of General Burns. Damaged goods. No one wanted to get caught in the blast radius of his fury. That isolation felt colder and more terrifying than the night in my Jeep. The world I had dedicated my life to had not just closed its doors, it had locked them and thrown away the key. That afternoon, I found myself sitting in a booth at a Waffle House off the highway. The air was thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee, but it was warm. I ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, the All-Star Special, and stared at the plate of scrambled eggs and bacon. Around me, life went on. Families laughed, their voices mingling with the clatter of silverware. In the booth next to mine, a group of young privates, barely out of basic training, were joking loudly about their upcoming leave. I used to be one of them, full of purpose and camaraderie. Now, I was an outsider, a ghost in uniform, invisible to the world I once commanded. I ate mechanically, each bite a struggle against the lump in my throat. I was trying so hard not to let the tears fall. Not here, not in this brightly lit monument to American normalcy. The stark contrast between their ordinary lives and my private hell made me feel profoundly, terrifyingly alone. The second night was even colder. I sat in my Jeep, the engine off to conserve gas, a cheap wool blanket pulled up to my chin. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deep, crushing despair. This was it. This was my life now. I had nothing. No home, no career, no family, no friends. For a terrifying moment, I just wanted to give up, to let the cold and the darkness swallow me whole. I fumbled with the radio, desperate for any sound to fill the silence. It landed on a public radio station, and a voice, warm and steady, cut through the static. It was a podcast, a recording of a talk by Brené Brown. I'd heard her name before but had never really listened. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. Her voice filled the small space of my Jeep. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. The words hit me like a physical blow, a lightning strike to my numb soul. All my life, I had been taught that strength was about enduring in silence, about showing no weakness. I had stood there, smiling, while my father took credit for my work. I had nodded politely while he insulted me. I had stayed silent. But that wasn't strength. It was surrender. Brené's voice continued, and it felt like she was speaking directly to me, sitting in that dark parking lot. It's having the courage to ask for what you need, to say, "I need help." I realized my mother had told me the same thing years ago. Your strength is knowing when you've endured enough. I had endured enough. My silent suffering wasn't honor. It was fear. Real courage, I suddenly understood, wasn't about hiding my pain. It was about having the guts to face it, to speak up, to ask for help, even when I was terrified of the answer, even when I had no control over the outcome. If you've ever felt like the world has turned its back on you, or if you've ever found strength in an unexpected place, please hit that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple, "I'm still here." Let's show each other we're not alone in these fights. My hand, trembling slightly, reached for my phone. My thumb scrolled through the contact list, past the names of the colleagues who had abandoned me. It stopped on a name I hadn't called in years. A name associated with a different kind of honor, a different kind of man. Call Robert Burns, my uncle. I took a shaky breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. The fear was still there, a knot of ice in my stomach. But underneath it, for the first time in days, a tiny flame flickered to life. I pressed the call button. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. His voice was exactly as I remembered it, gruff, steady, like stones rolling downhill. "Robert Burns." "Uncle Robert," I began, my own voice thin and shaky. "It's Amani." There was a pause, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he too would make an excuse. Instead, he simply said, "Where are you?" An hour later, I was sitting in a small, quiet coffee shop tucked away on a cobblestone street in Old Town Alexandria. Colonel Robert Burns was the opposite of his older brother in every conceivable way. Where my father was tall and broad, Robert was wiry and compact. Where my father's face was smooth and handsome, my uncle's was a roadmap of harsh sun and hard-won experience. But his eyes were clear and direct, holding a quiet integrity my father's had lost long ago. He listened to my story without interruption, his gaze never leaving my face. He didn't offer pity or shock. When I finished, the shame and exhaustion washing over me again, he simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He pushed it across the small wooden table. It was a bundle of cash. "It's all I've got in savings right now. Take it, get a motel room, a hot meal. You are not alone in this, Amani." The simple finality in his words broke something open inside me. It was the first wave of real human kindness I had felt in days, and it was almost painful. He leaned forward, his voice low. "My brother, Marcus, sold his soul for a pair of silver stars a long time ago. He was always pathologically jealous of talent he couldn't control. He was jealous of me, and God knows, he was jealous of your mother." He shook his head, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. "Evelyn knew it. She saw this coming. And she damn well did not go quietly." He slid a business card across the table. "She made me promise to give you this if the worst ever happened. Call him. He's been waiting." The card read, "David Chen, S-Key." The next day, I found myself in a small, dignified law office in a brownstone just off K Street in D.C. The office was filled with law books and the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock. David Chen was a calm, impeccably dressed Asian-American man in his 50s with kind eyes. He didn't begin with the usual empty condolences. He poured me a cup of hot jasmine tea, the fragrant steam a small comfort in my shattered world. "Your mother," he began, his voice serene, "was the most intelligent and courageous woman I've ever had the privilege of representing. She anticipated everything." He opened a leather-bound portfolio on his desk. "This is your mother's true last will and testament. What your father has is real, but it's incomplete. It's the bait." He explained that my mother had created a secret codicil, a hidden addendum to the will. It contained a single, brutal clause. If, within 30 days of her death, General Marcus Burns took any action to terminate my military career or remove me from my home, the entire inheritance, every dollar, every share, every brick of the house, would be immediately diverted from him and placed into a trust. The Evelyn Burns Trust. "And who is the sole beneficiary of this trust?" David asked, a slight smile touching his lips. I was speechless. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a plan. It was a test. A test of my father's character that my mother knew, with absolute certainty, he would fail. My despair began to recede, replaced by a staggering awe at her brilliant strategic love. "But that," David said, turning to his computer, was just the defensive measure. This is her masterpiece. He brought up a complex flowchart on the screen. For the last 2 years, using a series of anonymous shell corporations, Evelyn was quietly buying up shares of Aegis Defense on the open market. Your father, in his arrogance, signed off on dozens of financial transfers without ever reading the fine print, assuming it was just your mother managing her investment portfolio. David pointed to a number on the screen that made my head spin. As of her death, your mother secretly controlled 45% of the company. My jaw dropped. I couldn't process it. The assets from the will, once they are transferred to the trust after your father triggers the clause, will give you more than enough capital to purchase another 6% of stock, he explained calmly. Amani, your mother didn't just leave you money. She left you the company. This wasn't about getting justice. This was a corporate coup, orchestrated from beyond the grave. It was the most audacious, brilliant, and ruthless strategic plan I had ever seen. And my mother had built it, all while fighting for her life. Finally, David reached into a drawer and pulled out a small black USB drive. He handed it to me. She wanted you to see this last. Alone. That night, in a sterile motel room paid for with my uncle's money, I plugged the USB into my laptop. My mother's face filled the screen. She was in a hospital bed, gaunt and frail, the disease having stolen her physical strength. But her eyes were on fire. They held the same unwavering resolve I had seen her whole life. Amani, she began, her voice weak but clear. She didn't waste time on sentiment. She launched into a detailed, factual deposition, listing every project my father had stolen from me over the past 8 years, with dates, file names, and names of witnesses. She stated, for the record, that Project Chimera was 100% my intellectual property. She ended by looking directly into the camera, as if she could see me through time and space. If you are watching this, my love, it means the worst has happened. It means he showed his true colors. Do not weep for me. Fight. Take back what is yours and build a legacy based on truth, not on smoke and mirrors. That is how you will honor me. The video ended. The tears I had refused to shed in the Waffle House, the tears I had choked back in my father's presence, finally came. They weren't tears of grief or despair. They were tears of profound gratitude, of overwhelming love, and of a violent, unshakable resolve. The ghost in the machine had just been handed a sword. David Chen had called it the 30-day clause. It was the linchpin of my mother's plan, a test of character with a 30-day fuse. My father lasted 7. On the 7th day, my Uncle Robert and I sat in the living room of the drab corporate apartment he'd rented for me, a temporary safe house in a world that felt anything but. The television was tuned to C-SPAN. On the screen, my father stood at the podium in the Pentagon press briefing room, a grim, somber expression expertly arranged on his face. He looked every inch the stoic, burdened leader. As a father, he began, his voice thick with counterfeit emotion, there is nothing more painful than having to make a decision like this. I felt my uncle shift beside me on the couch. I just stared at the screen, my hands clenched into tight fists in my lap. My father was a master of optics, and this was his grand performance. He proceeded to weave a heart-wrenching narrative for the assembled press corps. He spoke of his beloved daughter, Amani, as a troubled soul. An officer with great potential, but who was, tragically, unstable and unable to handle the pressures of high-level strategic command. He talked about her attempts to leverage the family name for advancement. He told the world's most respected defense journalists that my honorable discharge from the military, a discharge he had orchestrated, was an act of fatherly love. It was, he said, to protect me from myself. Every lie was a perfectly polished stone, laid with precision to build a wall around his reputation and a prison around mine. And every lie was being recorded, time-stamped, and broadcast nationally. He was, as David Chen predicted, digging his own grave with his tongue. Then came the moment we were waiting for. A sharp, incisive reporter from the Washington Post stood up. General Burns, there are rumors that Major Burns was, in fact, the true architect behind Project Chimera. What's your comment on that? A flicker of something, Annoyance, panic, crossed my father's face before being instantly suppressed. He chuckled, a deep, condescending sound that filled the briefing room. He shook his head as if dealing with a fanciful child. "I love my daughter," he said, his voice dripping with paternalistic pity. "But we have to be realistic." Amani assisted with basic paperwork. She helped coordinate meetings. Her talents are limited. He paused for effect, letting the insult land. Chimera was my vision, the culmination of my 30 years of battlefield experience. He didn't just deny my work, he trivialized it. He erased 8 years of my life, thousands of hours of grueling intellectual labor, and reduced it all to clerical support. He painted me as a glorified secretary, a foolish girl playing at being a strategist in her powerful father's world. I felt a hot, sharp sting behind my eyes, a visceral pain that was separate from the cold, strategic part of my brain. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. A text from David Chen. "Perfect. He's hanging himself with his own lies. We have everything we need on the record." I took a sharp breath, the air feeling thin and metallic. He thought he was delivering the killing blow, but he was actually loading our weapon. He was confirming, in his own words, the very narrative of exploitation my mother had laid out in her video deposition. Another vibration, this one from an unknown number David had told me to expect. It was Admiral Holloway, the chairman of the Aegis Board of Directors and an old friend of my mother's. "I'm watching this. It's a disgrace. The board will not stand for it. My father's arrogance was doing more to build my alliance than I ever could have. He thought he was projecting strength, cementing his legacy. In reality, he was pushing his own board members, the very people whose loyalty he needed, directly into my camp. He was so blinded by his own narrative that he couldn't see the trap closing around him. But even knowing all this, even knowing it was part of a larger, brilliant plan, watching the man who was supposed to be my protector publicly assassinate my character was an agonizing experience. It felt like being flayed alive, one strip of my honor at a time. I watched his eyes on the high-definition screen. There was no hesitation, no flicker of guilt. There was only the absolute, unshakable conviction of a narcissist. He believed his own lies. He had repeated them to himself for so long that they had become his truth. And in that moment, I finally accepted it. The father I had once loved, the hero I had looked up to as a child, was well and truly gone. He hadn't just died, he had been consumed. The man on that stage was a monster wearing my father's face, a hollow man in a decorated uniform. The painful acceptance didn't break me. It freed me. It severed the last lingering thread of hope for a relationship that never truly existed. The pain of that final cut was immense, but it cauterized the wound. The sorrow and the hurt began to cool, hardening into something else. Something cold, sharp, and unbreakable, an iron will. As the press conference ended and the screen filled with analysts discussing the brave and difficult decision made by General Burns, my phone buzzed one last time. It wasn't David or the Admiral. It was an encrypted message from a number I didn't recognize. The text was short, a lifeline thrown into the middle of my war zone. "He's gone too far. I can help. Meet me at the data archive tonight. KT." The safe house my uncle had found was a nondescript brownstone in Georgetown. Inside, it was our war room. The encrypted message burned on my phone screen. "KT," I knew immediately who it was. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka, head of Aegis Cybersecurity, a good man, a quiet man. David Chen paced in front of the fireplace. "The legal framework is solid," he said, his voice tense with anticipation. "Your mother's testimony, your father's public statements. We have enough to win in court. But to take him down at the summit, in front of his peers, we need a knockout blow. Something visual, undeniable." I looked from David to my uncle. "I know what it is," I said, my voice steady. "The server logs, the file timestamps, every draft of Chimera, from conception to completion. It's all in the Aegis data archive." I took a breath. "My security access expires at midnight tonight." A heavy silence filled the room. This was no longer a legal battle. It was a black op. The risks were astronomical. If I was caught, it wouldn't be a family dispute. It would be corporate espionage, a felony. My career wouldn't just be over, I would be facing prison time. Everything my mother had built would be for nothing. My Uncle Robert was the first to speak, his voice grim. It's a fortress, Amani. Marcus designed the security protocols himself. Which means I know how to beat them, I countered. The fear was a cold knot in my gut. But the iron will I'd found was hotter. I was done being a ghost. It was time to haunt the machine. That night, I traded my uniform for a simple black jacket and pants. I drove my Jeep not with aimless despair, but with cold, calculated purpose. The Aegis Defense Headquarters in Reston, Virginia, rose from the darkness like a glass and steel mausoleum. The fortress my father built with my mother's money and my mind. I parked a block away and approached on foot, my old employee ID card feeling flimsy and useless in my hand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I approached the employee entrance. The clock on my phone read 11:42 p.m. 18 minutes until my digital ghost was exorcised from the system. I held the card up to the reader. The moment stretched into an eternity. I held my breath, waiting for the piercing siren of a failed entry. Instead, I heard a quiet beep. A small green light blinked. The lock clicked open. I was in. I slipped inside, melting into the familiar shadows. The hallways, usually bustling with activity, were dark and silent. My footsteps echoed softly on the polished marble floors. This place had been my second home for 8 years. The geography of its corridors mapped onto my soul. Now it felt like enemy territory. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. I made my way to the sub-level basement where the data archive was housed. It was a cold, sterile room, the only sound the constant low hum of dozens of servers, their blinking lights like a galaxy of sleeping eyes. This room was the company's brain, and somewhere inside it was the proof of my existence. I found an open terminal, slid in a high-speed flash drive, and entered my credentials. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating firewalls and security partitions I myself had helped design. I located the Chimera project files, terabytes of data, and initiated the transfer. A green progress bar appeared on the screen. 1%. 2%. It was agonizingly slow. Every hum of the servers, every creak of the building, sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. Suddenly, the door to the server room hissed open. I spun around, my body instantly dropping into a defensive crouch. My heart seized. It was over. Sergeant Kenji Tanaka stood in the doorway. He wasn't in uniform. He didn't look surprised or alarmed. He simply closed the door quietly behind him. "I was waiting for you, Major," he said, his voice a low whisper. He gestured to a small monitor on the wall that I hadn't noticed. "I've looped the security feed and disabled the silent alarm on your access ID. It gives you a 15-minute window before the system flags it." I stared at him, bewildered. "Why?" He looked down for a moment. "My daughter. She got sick a few years ago. Leukemia. The treatments were astronomical. The insurance wouldn't cover all of it." He looked back up at me, and I saw a profound debt in his eyes. "Your mother found out. She set up an anonymous grant through the company's charity fund, paid for everything, saved my little girl's life." He swallowed hard. "She was a good woman, Major. An honorable woman. I can't stand by and watch what the general is doing to you. To her memory." He then held out a second, larger external hard drive. "This is from my personal backups. It's 7 years of security camera footage from the R&D wing in the executive offices, plus access logs that are supposed to be wiped every 6 months. No one else knows it exists. Use it to get justice for her." I took the drive, my hand trembling. "Thank you, Kenji." Just as he said it, the progress bar for my data transfer hit 98%. And then, all hell broke loose. A piercing, deafening alarm blared through the room. Red lights began to flash, bathing the server room in a hellish glow. "He must have moved up the timeline," Kenji shouted over the noise. "He's terminating your access now." My download completed. I ripped the flash drive from the port. "Time's up. This way. Kenji yelled, pulling me toward a maintenance panel on the far wall. He wrenched it open, revealing a narrow, dark service corridor. Go. We plunged into the corridor just as we heard the heavy thud of security boots pounding down the main hallway. We ran, the sound of their pursuit echoing behind us. We reached a steel door, marked with an emergency exit sign. Kenji shoved the door open and then turned, planting his feet and holding it. Go, Major. I'll hold them off. I'll tell them I was investigating a system glitch. There was no time to argue. I burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. In my hands, I clutched two hard drives. One held the proof of my work. The other, the proof of a good soldier's loyalty. I had my weapons. The personal battle was over. Now it was time to prepare for the public war. David Chen's law office became our war room. The two hard drives I had risked everything for sat in the center of his large conference table like unexploded bombs. For the next 48 hours, the three of us, David, my uncle Robert, and I, embarked on our final pre-battle preparations. This was no longer about survival. It was about overwhelming force. We assembled our arsenal. The data wasn't just a collection of dry technical files, it was the digital ghost of my last 8 years. We had it all. Every early draft of every major project, time-stamped at 2, 3, 4 in the morning under my user ID. The server logs that showed my login was the only one to access the core strategic files for months at a time. Kenji Tanaka's hard drive was the crown jewel, a 7-year compilation of security footage. We watched a time-lapse video that David's team stitched together, showing the lights of my office burning through the night year after year, while the executive wing, where my father's office was located, remained dark and silent. And finally, we had my mother's video. Her final damning testimony. David leaned back in his chair, a confident, predatory smile on his face. He looked more like a prosecutor than a civil attorney. This isn't a lawsuit, Amani, he said, his voice quiet but intense. This is a public execution. The next piece of the puzzle came in the form of a dinner invitation. Admiral Holloway, the chairman of the Aegis Board, requested a meeting. We met in a quiet private room at the Occidental, a historic DC restaurant where deals were made and secrets were kept. The Admiral was an older man, a contemporary of my father's, but where my father was polished and performative, Holloway was weathered and authentic. He was a good friend of my mother's, and he looked at me with an expression of profound respect. We knew, Major, he admitted after we ordered, his voice low. We didn't know the specifics, but many of us on the board have seen Marcus's tendencies for years. Evelyn spoke to me before she passed. She asked us to remain silent, to trust her plan, and to trust you. He looked me straight in the eye. That silence is about to end. There are 5 other board members who are fed up with your father's tyranny and his reckless spending. They are ready to call for a vote of no confidence. He leaned in slightly. Just give us a justifiable public reason, and we will end his reign before the summit is over. The final piece was David's masterstroke. Armed with a mountain of preliminary evidence, including my father's public statements and a sworn affidavit from me, he went before a federal judge. He didn't file a lawsuit. Instead, he petitioned for a special order. And he got it. He presented it to us back at the war room. It was a court order, legally compelling the organizers of the National Defense Summit to allow me and my counsel the opportunity to present evidence directly pertaining to the intellectual property and authorship of Project Chimera. The presentation was to take place immediately following General Marcus Burns's keynote address. It was a move of pure genius. We weren't attacking from the outside. David had secured us a Trojan horse. My father was building his own stage, and the court was giving us the authority to walk onto it and burn it down around him. The night before the summit, we held our final briefing. It felt exactly like planning a mission. We synchronized our watches. We went over the floor plans of the Gaylord National Convention Center. We mapped out every contingency. Phase 1, my father's address. Let him build his own pedestal. Phase 2, David's intervention. As soon as my father finished, David would approach the stage, present the court order to the event organizers, and make a brief, explosive statement about the 30-day clause and my father's fraudulent claim to his inheritance. He would be the opening salvo. Phase 3. My advance. I would take the stage. I would present the hard data, the server logs, the timestamps, the security footage, the cold, irrefutable facts. I would be the main assault. Phase 4. The kill shot. I would play my mother's video. Her words would be the final, devastating blow. My uncle Robert, a man of few words, would run security, making sure no one from my father's side could interfere. There was no fear left in me. It had all been burned away, leaving behind only a cold, calm certainty. The hyper-focus of a soldier before a battle. The absolute clarity of a strategist whose moment has finally come. If you believe that truth, armed with courage, is the most powerful weapon of all, hit that like button. And in the comments below, let me know one word that describes what you hope happens to the general tomorrow. That night, I stood in front of the mirror in my hotel room. My Army service uniform, the Class A uniform, was hanging pristine and ready. I put it on, piece by piece. The jacket, the decorations, the polished brass. For years, when I wore this uniform, I felt like an imposter, a ghost hiding behind my father's name. But as I looked at my reflection now, I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a ghost. I saw a soldier. I saw my mother's daughter. I leaned closer to the mirror, my voice a quiet whisper in the silent room. "Mom," I said, "tomorrow I finish the war you started." October 25th. The main ballroom of the Gaylord National was a universe of its own, filled with 300 of the most powerful people in the American defense industry, generals, admirals, senators, and CEOs. I sat in the 5th row, a ghost in a Class A uniform, watching my father take the stage for his keynote address at the National Defense Summit. He bathed in the spotlight, absorbing the thunderous applause like a demigod. He was at the absolute zenith of his power. "Today," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "I'm not just going to tell you about the future of warfare. I'm going to show it to you." On the massive screen behind him, my work appeared. My complex tactical diagrams, my intricate 3D threat simulations for Project Chimera. He presented it all as his own, his voice weaving a grand narrative of his sleepless nights and decades of battlefield experience that had culminated in this masterpiece. He was brilliant, he was charming, he was utterly convincing. And I sat there, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, watching a monster enjoy his last meal. I felt a cold, lethal calm settle over me. The time for emotion was over. It was time to execute the mission. He finished his speech with a flourish, raising his arms to accept the standing ovation. The applause was deafening. This was his moment of ultimate triumph. And that's when David Chen stood up. He didn't shout. He just stood, a calm, immovable object in a sea of adulation. But his presence was enough. One by one, the people nearby noticed him and stopped clapping. The silence spread like a ripple in a pond. "General Burns," David called out, his voice clear and cutting through the dying applause. "My name is David Chen, and I have a court order." A shocked gasp went through the room. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to confusion in a heartbeat. Two court marshals, who had been waiting discreetly at the back, walked briskly down the center aisle and ascended the stage. They handed the legal document to my father, whose triumphant smile had frozen on his face. David's voice filled the stunned silence. "This order pertains to the fraudulent claim General Burns has made on the estate of his late wife, Evelyn Burns." David let that sink in. "And to the conditions of a 30-day clause he triggered when he legally expelled his own daughter, Major Amani Burns, from her home just 3 days after her mother's funeral." A low murmur swept through the audience. My father's face went from confused to pale. "And regarding his character," David said, his voice dropping, "I'd like to play a short recording, obtained legally from a voicemail he left for his brother, Colonel Robert Burns, on the day of the funeral." David held up his phone to the microphone at the press lectern, and my father's voice, Not the polished, commanding tone from the speech, but a venomous, snarling whisper echoed through the ballroom's sound system. "She's a liability, Robert. If she wants to grieve, tell her to find somewhere else to do it." The sound was horrifyingly clear. 300 pairs of eyes, the entire leadership of the military-industrial complex, stared at my father. He stood there, under the hot stage lights, looking small and exposed, his face the color of ash. Then, it was my turn. I stood up and walked down the aisle. The crowd parted for me, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and morbid curiosity. I walked with my back straight, my gaze fixed on the stage. I didn't look at my father. I ascended the steps, walked to the podium, and calmly inserted my USB drive into the laptop. I didn't say a word. The evidence would speak for me. On the massive screen, a server log appeared, rows of data, cold and clinical. I used the laser pointer to highlight my user ID, M. Burns, and the timestamps. 02:14 a.m., 03:27 a.m., 04:52 a.m., night after night, year after year. Next, Kenji Tanaka's time-lapse video. 7 years of my life, compressed into 60 seconds. The footage showed my office light snapping on in the dead of night, me at my desk, surrounded by papers and monitors, while the rest of the floor, including my father's sprawling corner office, remained a dark, empty void. The visual was brutal, undeniable. The entire narrative he had built, his sleepless nights, his singular vision, crumbled into dust in absolute silence. For the final blow, I opened the last file. "One final piece of evidence," I said, my voice steady, amplified by the microphone. "A recorded deposition from the true architect of Project Chimera." My mother's face filled the screen. She was frail, in her hospital bed, but her eyes were filled with an unyielding fire. Her voice, though weak, was imbued with the absolute authority of truth. She systematically dismantled every lie, every stolen project, every public manipulation. She concluded by looking directly into the camera. "Project Chimera, in its entirety, is the intellectual property of my daughter, Major Amani Burns. Any claim to the contrary by my husband, General Marcus Burns, is a falsehood." The video ended. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with judgment. Then, from the front row, Admiral Holloway stood up. He turned not to me or my father, but to the other board members of Aegis Defense scattered throughout the audience. As chairman of the board of Aegis Defense, his voice boomed with righteous fury, "I am invoking our corporate bylaws to call an emergency board meeting, right here, right now." 11 board members stood up from their seats, their faces grim. They gathered in a tight circle at the side of the ballroom. There was no debate. The vote took less than a minute. Holloway turned back to face the stage, his eyes locking onto my father. He spoke with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. "General Marcus Burns," he declared, his voice ringing through the silent hall. "By a unanimous vote of the board of directors, you are hereby terminated as CEO of Aegis Defense, effective immediately." A collective gasp went through the room. The empire was gone. The king was dethroned. Justice had been served. My father staggered back, his hand clutching the podium for support. He looked out at the sea of faces, his colleagues, his rivals, his friends, and saw only condemnation. He stumbled past me to exit the stage, his eyes empty, his entire world demolished in the space of 10 minutes. As he passed, he looked at me, a pathetic, broken man. "Why?" he whispered, the sound barely audible. I met his gaze, my own voice as cold and clear as ice. "Because you forgot the definition of honor." Honor. That was the word I had left him with. In the chaotic hours and days that followed the summit, that word became my North Star. The downfall of General Marcus Burns wasn't just a corporate tremor, it was a media earthquake. Defense News ran a headline that read, "The Fall of a Titan. Aegis enters a new era." The Wall Street Journal published a brilliant piece of investigative journalism titled, "The Hostile Takeover from Beyond the Grave." They called my mother's plan a masterpiece of strategic finance and legal warfare. My father had built his empire on the illusion of strength, I was about to rebuild it on a foundation of truth. And the market responded. In the 2 days following the summit, instead of plummeting as many expected, Aegis Defense stock surged by 15%. It was a clear signal from Wall Street. They valued transparency and actual talent far more than a manufactured reputation. Overnight, I went from being a ghost in the machine to a symbol of resilience and integrity, especially within the tight-knit community of women in the armed forces. The day after the summit, the Evelyn Burns Trust was officially activated, making me the majority shareholder of Aegis Defense. The remaining board members, led by Admiral Holloway, gave me their full proxy. The company was mine to command. My first act was to call an emergency executive session. I walked into the same boardroom where my contributions had been dismissed for 8 years. This time, no one dared to look away. I didn't take the CEO's chair at the head of the table. I stood. "Admiral Holloway," I said, my voice clear and steady, "the board has asked me to take the role of CEO. I'm declining. However, I would be honored if you would accept the position of interim CEO to guide us through this transition." A wave of relief and respect washed over the Admiral's face. He simply nodded. "I accept." "Thank you," I said. "The position I will be taking is the one I've earned, Chief Strategy Officer." A new, potent silence filled the room. This wasn't a hostile takeover fueled by vengeance. It was a restoration. My next order of business was a house cleaning. I looked at 3 senior VPs sitting at the table, men who had been my father's loyal sycophants, men who had watched him steal my work and had remained silent. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, "your positions have been eliminated. Security will escort you out." There was no argument. They knew the game was up. Then, I summoned Sergeant Kenji Tanaka. He entered the boardroom looking nervous, his eyes fixed on the floor. I asked him to stand before the new leadership team. Sergeant Tanaka acted with immense courage and integrity, at great personal risk, I announced to the room. He upheld the true meaning of honor. It is therefore my first official act as CSO to promote him. Effective immediately, Mr. Tanaka is the new Chief of Cybersecurity for all of Aegis Defense. Kenji looked up, his eyes wide with shock and then shining with gratitude. The message to everyone in that room was crystal clear. Under the new Aegis, loyalty to the truth would be rewarded. Integrity was now the company's most valuable asset. But the most important change was yet to come. The next day, I drafted a new company-wide mandate. I called it the Evelyn Burns Protocol. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a constitutional amendment to our corporate culture. The protocol was a system designed to ensure that every contribution from every employee at every level was seen, documented, and credited. Project reports would now be required to list the names of every single team member, not just the project lead. Client presentations would be delivered by the strategists and engineers who actually did the work. It wasn't just a policy. It was a cultural revolution. It was a promise that Aegis would no longer be a dictatorship run on the ego of one man, but a meritocracy built on the collective brilliance and respect of all its people. It was the company my mother had always wanted to build. A few days later, I received a call. It wasn't from a reporter or a board member. It was from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. I took the call in what used to be my father's office. The secretary's voice was warm and direct. "Major Burns," he said. And for the first time, my rank felt like a badge of honor, not an insult. "We've reviewed the situation. The Pentagon is not only reinstating the Project Chimera contract, we are increasing its budget by 20%. I was stunned into silence. "Let me be clear, Major," he continued. "We are not investing in the company. We are investing in you. Show us the future." That was it. That was the ultimate validation. It wasn't given to the daughter of a famous general. It was earned by the strategist who had proven her worth. In that moment, I knew I hadn't just reclaimed my past. I had seized control of my future. Late that night, long after everyone else had gone home, I stood alone in the vast CEO office. The nameplate on the door was gone, leaving a faint outline. The cavernous room felt haunted by the ghost of my father's ambition. His oversized leather chair sat behind the massive mahogany desk, a silent, empty throne. I didn't sit in it. Instead, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glittering expanse of the Washington, D.C. metro area. In the distance, I could see the Lincoln Memorial, a white beacon in the darkness. I thought about the word legacy, the one my mother had given me, forged in secrets and sacrifice, and the one that was now mine to build, out here, in the light. Victory isn't a single, explosive moment. It's the quiet dawn that follows the battle. In the months after the summit, the noise began to fade. The headlines were replaced by the steady, quiet work of rebuilding. The empire wasn't my father's to destroy anymore. It was my mother's to reimagine and mine to build. 3 months into my new role as Chief Strategy Officer, a letter arrived at my office. It was handwritten on simple, plain stationery. I recognized the handwriting instantly, though it was shakier now, stripped of its former arrogant authority. It was from my father. He didn't apologize for what he had done. A true narcissist is incapable of such an admission. There was no, "I'm sorry." Instead, he did something far more shocking. He admitted the truth. He wrote about Evelyn's genius and my talent, acknowledging them as facts he could no longer deny. He said he had started therapy, that he was trying to understand the emptiness that had driven him his entire life. He then asked if there might be an unpaid advisory role for him at the Evelyn Burns Trust, to do something meaningful with what's left of my life. I read the letter twice, then called my uncle Robert. We talked for an hour. In the end, the decision was mine. It wasn't about forgiveness. Forgiveness felt impossible. It was about a conscious choice. I would not allow his hatred to write the final chapter of my life. I would not let bitterness become my co-pilot. I agreed. The boundaries we established were made of steel. He could contribute his expertise to the trust's financial management, but he would hold no power, no title, and have no say in its mission. He could work for my mother's legacy, but he could never again control it. The Evelyn Burns Trust officially launched that spring. Its first initiative was a scholarship program, fully funding 10 of the most outstanding female cadets at West Point each year, specifically those specializing in STEM and strategic studies. At the inaugural ceremony, I stood at a podium, not to fight a war, but to build a future. My mother believed that talent knows no gender, and that honor is not found on a uniform's shoulder boards, I told the small, distinguished crowd. Her legacy is not in money. It is in opportunity. The opportunity for brilliant minds to shine, unhindered by any shadow. In the back row, sitting alone, my father applauded quietly. It wasn't redemption, but perhaps it was a beginning. 6 months after the summit, Project Chimera was officially launched. I stood on a stage again, this time as its true leader. The room was filled with Pentagon officials and Aegis engineers. I didn't talk about myself. Instead, I introduced my team, one by one. I spoke about Dr. Eris Thorne, our lead engineer, and his revolutionary work on neural network processing. I introduced Priya Singh, our junior data analyst, and described how her unique algorithm had solved a critical flaw in our threat assessment model. This was the Evelyn Burns Protocol in action. This was the new Aegis. After the ceremony, I skipped the champagne reception. I got in my Jeep and drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The endless rows of white headstones stood in silent, orderly tribute under the afternoon sun. I found my mother's grave and placed a small bouquet of white daisies at its base. The simple stone read, "Evelyn Burns, a brilliant mind, a loving heart." I knelt on the perfectly manicured grass. "I did it, Mom," I whispered to the quiet stone. "We did it. And we built it on the truth." Later that evening, back in my own quiet apartment, a place that finally felt like home, I opened the one small box of keepsakes I had managed to save. It was the box that held the silver picture frame and the few small mementos he hadn't destroyed. Tucked beneath a false bottom, something I'd never noticed before, was one last letter. It was sealed. The front simply said, Amani. The date on the back was from the day my mother established the trust. My hands trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Amani," her familiar, elegant script read. The greatest gift I am leaving you is not a company or a fortune. It is permission. The permission to choose yourself. The permission to set boundaries, even when it's hard. The permission to define success and honor on your own terms. Live a brilliant life, my love. Not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to be happy. That, my daughter, is our true legacy. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box. A slow smile spread across my face, the first truly peaceful smile I'd had in years. The battle was won. But this feeling of quiet, unburdened freedom, this was the victory. The storm had passed. The dawn was truly beginning. And so, that's my story. It took walking through fire, but I finally understood the gift my mother truly left me. The permission to define my own honor. The battle with my father is over, but the work of building a legacy of truth is just beginning. Your storm may look different than mine, but the dawn is always waiting for you too. If you believe in the power of rewriting your own narrative and finding strength in the truth, please subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening.